Greetings and salutations, students of Biblical Greek. We continue our study of the language by adding a new kind of verbs that we haven't seen before called contract verbs. Now, these are verbs that are going to end in a vowel, and so when you take those vowel stem, the stem of a verb that ends in a vowel, and you put the suffix that ends in a vowel together, they're going to contract and change, and so they're going to look unlike what we've seen before, but there's a pattern. We can learn the pattern and recognize these are contract verbs. So we're not learning new verb endings, new verb suffixes. What we're learning is how existing suffixes that we already know interact with verbs as we see them. So we're going to learn contract verbs. We're going to talk a bit about reflexive pronouns, and then we're going to talk about the adjective pas, pasa, pon. So let's get right into it. This is lesson 21 of N. Clayton Croy's Primer of Biblical Greek. So Greek verbs, as we know, as we've seen, change or morph with different suffixes to determine their tense, voice, and mood. Now, one feature of morphology that we haven't seen is the way that verbs that end with vowels contract with the vowels of their suffixes. So, for example, we have the Greek verb that lots of people have heard. If there's one Greek word people know, it's the verb or the word for love, agape. And in the verb form, agapao, I love. Now, the stem of the verb is agapa, ends in that alpha. When the alpha comes in contact with vowels in the verb suffixes, for example, o, ace, a, amen, edi, usi, the alpha and those vowels contract into new vowels. So let's look at the example that we see on these suffixes. So agapa, o, the alpha disappears, and the omega, it's agapo, and notice the omega gets that circumflex accent. So in this case, what we have is what we would expect, where the alpha and the omega contract, and you just get that lengthened omega with the longer verb or longer accent on the end of the vowel. Similarly, agapao with o ace, second person singular, the epsilon iota combines with the alpha to be agapas. The alpha with the epsilon iota becomes agapa. The alpha with the omicron for amen becomes agapomen. The epsilon with the alpha becomes agapate. The alpha with the omicron upsilon in usi or usin becomes osin. So you can see there's this pattern of the vowel at the end of agapao combining with the vowels in your normal o, ace, a, amen, edi, usi, on, s, a, amen, edi, on, omai, a, etai, amatha, este, ontai, omein, u, eta, amatha, este, onta. Endings that we already know, when those come in contact, there's going to be a contraction that's going to give maybe some unexpected endings to these verbs, and you're going to go, wait, what is this ending? You gotta sort of work backwards to know, okay, how have things contracted? These same rules apply in the imperfect, in the aorist, in the present, middle, passive, etc. In addition to morphing contracts, contract verbs can also lengthen the last vowel in the case of aorist and perfect verbs. So we all know that aorists like to have those sa, se, saman, sadi, san endings in the first aorist, or ka, kas, ke, kamen, kati, kan endings in the perfect. And so what happens when you have that sigma and the verb stem ends in a vowel? Well, it lengthens. So, for example, poieo, I do, I make. When you turn it in the first aorist, you have your normal sa, se, saman, sate, san endings. Of course, you're going to have your epsilon prefixes. So you should expect to see that with these contract verbs because the prefixes work the same. So epoe sa, epoe sas, epoe se, epoe samen, epoe sate, epoe san. So notice you have your epsilon prefix just like you would expect to see on your normal first aorist active indicative verbs, but then you also have this lengthening of the epsilon that ends the verb stem before you get the sa, se, saman, sadi, san ending. The same thing happens with the perfect endings. You have the reduplication like you would expect in perfect, and then you have that ka, kas, ke, kamen, kati, kan endings. So what are the rules? What pattern can you expect to see in these contractions? Well, the rules of contraction are fairly straightforward. You can see the alpha plus the epsilon or the eta stays in alpha. So, for example, in the verb genao, I beget, in the third person singular, becomes genai. So the epsilon iota becomes genai. Third person singular, present active. He begets. The alpha, when it comes in contact with one of those omicron, omega, or the diphthong omicron, upsilon, lengthens to the omega. So, for example, agapan, third person imperfect active, they were loving, would be agapomen. Now, notice you have the epsilon prefix, just like you would expect to see on those imperfect verbs. So you have that epsilon prefix plus the on ending, which could be first person singular or third person plural. In this case, we're gonna say it's third person plural. And so when that omicron here comes in contact with the alpha at the end of the vowel, it's gonna lengthen into the omega. Another example, in epsilon, epsilon becomes epsilon iota. So zeteo, I seek, for zetete, epsilon tau, epsilon ending, second person plural, present active indicative. You seek becomes zetete. So it goes to that diphthong epsilon iota instead of two epsilons next to each other. Plerao in the imperfect, second person singular imperfect active, you were filling. Epsilon prefix, right? Because we're in the imperfect. So if you see that epsilon prefix, we're talking about an aorist, we're talking about an imperfect. And then you're going to have the normal ending, in this case, the second person singular on S, the S ending, the epsilon, when it comes in contact with the omicron, becomes U. So a plerus is second person singular, imperfect active, you were filling, and so on and so forth. So these are just examples of these rules of contraction. When you see the epsilon coming in contact with the eta, the omega, the alpha iota, the epsilon iota, the omicron iota, any of those diphthongs or long vowels, the epsilon is just going to drop out. And as you see, the omicron sound is going to win out in lengthen to the omega sound, either in the epsilon omega or in the epsilon omicron, or epsilon upsilon is going to be the diphthong omicron upsilon. So this is the rules of contraction. It's the pattern. I don't go through all of the examples because it just depends on which verb you're talking about, but the pattern is really about knowing how certain vowels come together. So alpha, epsilon, you go, okay, this chart is going to be alpha. Epsilon iota plus epsilon is going to be epsilon iota. Omicron plus omicron is going to be omicron upsilon diphthong. So this is just a rule chart to show you here's what's happening, and pretty soon you'll begin to recognize what's going on. So when you come across a word, what you have to do is look at its ending and go, okay, what contractions could have produced this so I can reconstruct the ending? But we're looking for all the same kinds of indicators of what kind of verb we're looking at. We're looking for epsilon prefixes. That's going to tell us if we're looking at an imperfect or an aorist verb. We're going to be looking for our normal oase, amineti, usi endings, but then thinking about how those may have changed as they've contracted with these vowels at the end of these contract verbs. The other thing I want to point out, two other things in this chapter. One is reflexive pronouns. Reflexive pronouns are pronouns that reflect back on the subject of the sentence or the clause in which they occur. Now, because they reflect the subject, they're never going to be nominative, right? You can't point back to the subject with the subject. You have to point back to the subject with something in the genitive, dative, or accusative case. So in the first person, myself is going to be masculine or feminine because a person isn't neuter. So you're not going to see neuter first person of itself, but you'll have of myself if it's a masculine subject or a feminine subject. Notice the rough breathing mark on the plural. So it's a mautu, a mauto, a mauton in the masculine, but then it switches to he mauton, he mautois, he mautus with that rough H sound, rough breathing mark in the masculine and feminine plurals. Now notice the masculine and feminine plurals are the same. Similarly, in the second person, what you're going to see is the sigma epsilon as the prefix to seautu, seauto, seauton, and then it switches again. Then you have the second person is the same with that he mautu, he mauton, he mautois, he mautus, that rough breathing mark ending that we saw in the first person. And then, of course, in the third person, because you could have of himself, of herself, of themselves, or itself, and that is going to be the rough breathing mark throughout. So be looking for those reflexive pronouns. Mostly when you see these in the New Testament, they're going to be in that third person. There's not a lot. I'm sure there are some examples, but there's not as many in the first or second person reflexive pronouns. You're mostly going to see these in the third person. The last thing in this chapter that I want us to take note of is pas, upon, which essentially functions like an adjective. So because it functions, or it is an adjective, it means all or every. So pas, upon in the nominative, pantas, panti, panta, pantes, panton, pasi, pantas. So you'll notice these look exactly like what you see with third declension endings with participle endings in the present active indicative or present active participle endings that you're used to seeing. These are not that surprising, so you should be able to recognize them that way. So how do these work? Like adjectives, it occurs a little over 1,000 times in the New Testament, and it can function in 4 different ways. Number one, in the predicate position, so that is without a definite article on the adjective, it can mean all. In the attributive position, that is with a definite article attributed to a particular noun, it's the whole. In the anarthrous position, so without a definite article on a noun or an adjective, it just means all. In the substantive position, so if it's being used as the noun, it can just mean everyone or all things in the neuter. So you'll see this. It just means all, whole, or every, and we'll see how it works in specific contexts when we look at some example sentences here from lesson 21. So we reviewed contract verbs, looking to understand how the vowels on the verb stem interact with the vowels in the suffixes of the various verb morphologies of o, ese, ameneti, usi, on, esse, ameneti, on, omein, u, eta, amata, este, anta, and so on and so forth. Learning how they contract. So we know the verb endings already, and now we're learning the rules of how they contract when we see them on these verb stems that end in different vowels. We've also looked at reflexive pronouns as well as pas, pasa, pon.